Or when my husband learned I would not be able to inherit anything from my father, and he shouted at me, "What? Is it incapable of being inherited? I have nothing for you. We are in the middle of a divorce." And later I took my revenge on my new husband and sister. I am Sandra, a 32 years old worker in an office, and my husband is Richard. We have been married for over 2 years. I was introduced to Richard by a relative and then getting married. My family was wealthy, and my sister Susan had no other children for them to worry about inheriting their money. So that when our relatives Terry and Nate found him, they introduced me. My husband came to live with us in my family house after. My mother died a couple of years ago, and my dad, hubby, and I lived together. My husband seemed very kind and treated my father well, but a relative who introduced him to me said something concerning just before our wedding. "I know I introduced Richard to you, but be careful. He's a bit obsessed with money." I was troubled by this warning so close to our wedding, but I didn't notice any signs of greed from my husband, so we went ahead and got married. Even after marriage, I kept an eye on my husband because of the relative's words, but he didn't seem obsessed with money. However, he did seem curious about my father's wealth, casually asking how much property we had when they were drinking together. My father openly talked about it, so I didn't worry too much. Another thing my husband was interested in was my sister. My sister is 5 years younger than me, lively and outgoing, in contrast to my calm demeanor. Her relationships with men are quite flashy. She doesn't look like me, and my husband was surprised when he first saw her. Susan is quite different from Sandra, isn't she? Seeing my husband fascinated by my beautiful sister, who was the complete opposite of plain and unnoticeable me, made me feel complicated. The relatives introduced me, a quiet and plain-looking person, because they were worried that if I didn't get married, there would be no one to inherit the family home. I thought there was no need to worry since I had a beautiful sister, but later I understood why the relatives were concerned. My father spoiled my sister, letting her go to college and even community college after graduation. My sister didn't have any particular goal in attending college or community college. She simply didn't want to work. My mother tried to persuade her to get a job right after college, but my father insisted on letting her go to community college. After graduating from community college, my sister got a job at my father's acquaintance's company, but quit after only 6 months. Her excuse for quitting surprised me. "I can't showcase my talents at that company." My mother and I were dumbfounded by my sister, who talked as if she understood everything about the job, even though she hadn't worked for even half a year. But my father believed her and quickly found her another job. After she started working at the new company, my mother fell ill and was hospitalized. When my mother was hospitalized, my sister visited the hospital every day, constantly taking time off work. She eventually quit this job too, saying she needed to take care of my mother, but her care was just sitting in the hospital room, chatting with my mother, or staring at her mobile phone in the waiting room. I had to go to the hospital to change my mother's laundry, and my sister was no help at all. My mother might have been happy to have someone to talk to, but about a month after being hospitalized, her condition worsened to the point where she couldn't even speak. Within 2 weeks of her condition worsening, my mother passed away. My father and sister were so shaken by the sudden news that they couldn't even prepare for the funeral, so I had to take care of everything. Thanks to the cooperation of our relatives, we were somehow able to send my mother off peacefully. After my mother's death, my sister started a part-time job and moved out to live on her own. Since her part-time earnings weren't enough to cover the rent, my father had been paying for her rent and utilities, and it seems she's using the money she earns for fun. Whenever her part-time salary isn't enough, she goes to my father to get some extra money. When my mother was alive, she was strict with my sister, so my father didn't give her any allowance. Now, he gives her as much as she wants. I thought it was no problem if both my father and sister were satisfied with this arrangement. Even after I got married and started living with my husband in my parents' home, my father continued to give my sister an allowance. I didn't notice at the time, but my sister was also asking my husband for money, and he was happily giving it to her. He couldn't say no to my beautiful sister, and he would give her money saying, "Keep this a secret from Sandra. If she finds out, she might get jealous." My sister seemed to be living off the money she got from my father and husband, going to her part-time job whenever she felt like it. But that lifestyle didn't last forever. It ended when my father fell ill and had to be hospitalized. I was taking care of my father, visiting the hospital between work, but my sister never showed up. Instead, she started calling me, demanding money. "I've been getting money from Dad every month, so keep giving it to me. The rent and public utilities are all being deducted from Dad's account," she spoke to me in an angry tone. I was surprised by the facts I learned for the first time. I was furious at my sister, who cared only about her life and not about our hospitalized father. I really wanted to hang up on her, but she seemed to be in trouble, so I asked her how much money my father had been giving her every month. "How much are you getting from Dad every month? Get a full-time job and live on the money you earn," I said. My sister answered grumpily, "Stop nagging. I was getting $1,000 a month. Rent is separate, you know." I was dumbfounded by my sister, who proudly told me the amount. I thought that if I kept giving this much money to my grown-up sister every month, she would never feel like working seriously. I didn't think it was a big problem to give money to my sister, as I thought my father would recover soon after being hospitalized. However, my father's condition suddenly worsened, and I hurriedly contacted our relatives. The doctor also told me it was a serious situation, and I was quite shocked. I wanted my husband's support during this time, but he rarely visited the hospital, claiming he was busy with work. Moreover, when he did show up, he would ask me inappropriate questions like, "Joseph's inheritance must be huge, right? Since you and your sister are the only heirs, are you going to split it in half?" I had no words to respond to my husband, who only talked about the inheritance. I felt both realization and disgust, understanding what the relatives meant when they said my husband was obsessed with money. When I called my sister to tell her about our father's critical condition, she was only concerned about her money. "More importantly, make sure you pay me every month. I can't live without that money." The call ended abruptly. I was furious at my sister's words, but I was also concerned about the faint male voice I heard on the other end of the phone. I had a bad feeling recognizing that voice. About a month later, my father passed away, and neither my sister nor my husband were there in his final moments. Having experienced my mother's funeral, I knew how heavy the task of preparing for a funeral could be. Moreover, neither my husband nor my sister helped with anything, and my sister didn't even attend the funeral. My husband did show up, but he disappeared right after, saying he had work. A relative who introduced me to my husband noticed his absence and asked me, "Where's Richard? It's strange for the host's husband to not be here, isn't it?" I could only respond with a wry smile. He was busy with work, so he went home. The relative signed up my answer, but I felt like sighing too. After my father's funeral ended and I finally had a moment to breathe, my husband asked me with a sleazy grin, "Finally, how much did you inherit? Even if you split it in half, you must have inherited a considerable amount, right?" Just As the relatives had warned me before marriage, my husband seemed consumed with thoughts of my father's inheritance. My sister got $92 million, and I got zero. I hadn't even talked to the lawyer yet, and I was still trying to process the funeral. Looking at my husband, who was happily talking about the inheritance, I felt like laughing more than getting angry. My husband, who believed my words, immediately yelled, "What? You can't inherit any property? I don't need you anymore. Divorced now." I felt the same way, so I shot back, "Let's do it. You married me for my father's inheritance in the first place. I'll divorce you," I shouted and thrust the prepared divorce papers at my husband. He seemed a little flustered, as if he had anticipated this, but he signed them anyway. As he left the house after signing the divorce papers, he said, "I'll divorce you, who gets zero inheritance, and remarry your sister Susan, who gets the $92 million, and left." I didn't care about his words and immediately proceeded with the divorce. I was able to part ways with my terrible husband. My ex-husband seemed to have started the process of marrying my sister the very next day. A few days later, I received a call from my ex-husband. "Do you still believe that story? When will you handle the inheritance? Hurry up and give Susan the $92 million, my ex-husband yelled over the phone. I had been waiting for him to contact me. I didn't want to reach out to my ex-husband, who had left the house on his own. I replied to him in a businesslike tone. "Let's discuss this at my place next Sunday. I'm preparing for the procedure and will be waiting." Thinking he would receive the inheritance, my ex-husband happily hung up, but I was looking forward to seeing his face when he learned the truth. On the weekend, my ex-husband and sister came to my family home, surprised to find that I had called a lawyer. However, my ex-husband seemed to convince himself. Of course, you need a lawyer when inheriting a large sum of money. Then the lawyer turned to my ex-husband with a puzzled look and began to speak. "Before we can discuss the inheritance, there's the matter of Sandra's compensation claim against Richard." He showed my ex-husband several photos, featuring him leaving my sister's house with clear dates marked. The lawyer addressed my ex-husband. "These are evidence photos of infidelity before the divorce was finalized, so you must pay compensation." I had heard my ex-husband talking about the inheritance over the phone with my sister and immediately asked the lawyer to investigate his infidelity. Perhaps they thought I was distracted by my father's funeral, but my ex-husband and sister met at her house almost daily, allowing me to gather plenty of evidence. The conversation shifted from inheritance to compensation, leaving my ex-husband and sister dumbfounded. But my ex-husband quickly recovered and retorted, "Compensation is nothing compared to the $92 million from the inheritance." "I'll pay it right away," he said, as he signed the compensation claim documents handed to him by the lawyer, acting all high and mighty. I confirmed it and told him, "Enjoy your life with my sister, who inherited zero. Since you signed, I'll make sure you pay the compensation." The moment they heard inheritance zero, my sister screamed, "Why is my mine getting 90? Her husband turned bright red and angrily said, "There's no way the inheritance is zero. I won't allow you to take it all for yourself." The lawyer calmly began to explain to the furious pair, "Susan is already the stepdaughter of your late mother, and since she was not legally adopted by your late father, there is no legal parent-child relationship. Therefore, Susan cannot inherit your father's estate." I also explained to my confused sister, "When our parents remarried, Susan was only about a year old, so you probably don't remember. But I do. I was 6 years old when our parents remarried, and I remember being happy to suddenly have a sister. I never thought that sister would steal my husband. Both parents were struggling with young children, and there was a mediator between them who thought it best for them to remarry. My mother loved me like her real daughter, and my father cherished my sister. Perhaps my father spoiled my sister because she wasn't his biological daughter, and he wanted to be extra careful. Although both parents remarried with children, my mother suspected my relatives of targeting my wealthy family's assets and refused to legally adopt my sister. The relatives only recommended marriage proposals to me because they knew I was the only one who could inherit my father's property. If my parents had had a child between them, things might have become even more complicated. But fortunately or unfortunately, they never had one. Now, I understand that my father continued to support my sister financially, even after she became an adult, because he couldn't pass on his inheritance to her. I also never legally adopted my mother, so we weren't legally parent and child, but it never mattered in our daily lives. It seems my parents never told my sister that they were both remarried, and she only learned the truth today. My ex-husband seemed to understand the situation immediately, his face turning from bright red to pale blue. He had not only failed to get the inheritance he was expecting from my sister, but had also signed documents to pay compensation. With a blue face, my ex-husband asked me, "Was what you said, my sister gets $92 million and I get nothing, a lie?" I held back my laughter and replied, "Of course it's a lie. It's to get back at you for cheating on me behind my back. Besides, there's no way a bankrupt inheritance would be worth $92 million. Even my wealthy father didn't have $92 million in inheritance." Suddenly, my sister, who had been silent, screamed, "I've been counting on Dad's inheritance and have done a lot of shopping. What will happen to the money Dad used to pay me? Will Sandra pay for it?" I answered my frightened sister, "You have a reliable husband now, so you don't need it anymore, do you? Let Richard support you." My sister stared at her pale-faced ex-husband, who shook his head in response. "I've also done a lot of shopping expecting the inheritance, so I can't afford it. Besides, I have to pay compensation, so I'm at my limit." After saying this, my husband suddenly began to apologize deeply to me. "Sandra, I'm sorry. It was my fault. Will you forgive me and start over?" A lawyer watching this was laughing as he prepared to leave. Where had the arrogant attitude gone when he first came to the house? His deep apology looked ridiculous. After the discussion, my ex-husband and sister left dejectedly, and they soon divorced. For my ex-husband, who remarried with the goal of inheriting from my sister, he seemed to have no interest in her since he didn't get the inheritance. He even said to himself that with the payment of compensation to me, he couldn't take care of my sister. My ex-husband had no assets, so it was decided to pay the compensation in installments from his monthly salary. The lawyer advised me that this way I wouldn't miss out. My sister, without the support of our father, had to work part-time every day, but she couldn't make the debt payments and ended up filing for personal bankruptcy. After that, she even gave up her condominium and disappeared, and no one knows where she went. My father had been supporting my sister financially, but by spoiling her like that, she became unable to work seriously. Afterward, I started living alone in my family home, and some relatives talked about introducing me to a potential marriage partner that I declined. I don't want to be introduced to another man like my ex-husband, so this time I want to find a marriage partner on my own.
My name is Julia Anderson. I've been married for 4 years and have a 2-year-old daughter. My husband works at a general hospital, and I thought we had a good relationship. But was I the only one who thought so? One day, while my husband was off to work, a woman stormed into the house. My daughter was out with her grandparents at an amusement park, and I was home alone. I had never seen this woman before, but she greeted me with a bright smile, and since she seemed nice, I thought it might be okay to let her into the house. As I made coffee and we started chatting casually, the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Please break up with him." Stunned by her sudden demand, I couldn't grasp what she meant. When I asked her to explain, she burst into tears. "I'm dating Ryan. I love him so much." Dating? You mean it's serious? Yes, I can't live without him. Please, let him be with me. I can't just agree to that suddenly. I had no idea he had a girlfriend. How could I know if that's true? I need to talk to him first. Please don't say that, just break up with him. It's not that simple to just break up. You mean you won't break up with him? Whether it was her overwhelming emotions or the fact that the conversation wasn't going her way, she attacked me, repeatedly striking my face with a coffee cup. Coffee splashed everywhere, staining the carpet, and I was increasingly covered in blood. I thought she was going to kill me. Just when I thought that, she seemed to snap back to reality, dropped the coffee cup on the floor, and left the house. As she walked out the front door, I rushed into my car and drove to the hospital where my husband worked. Despite the pain all over my body, I managed to get to the hospital and rasped out, "Please, call my husband." The nurse, shocked, replied, "There's no doctor by that name here," and took me to the examination room. I was asked something by the doctor, but all I could think about was that my husband was not there. My husband is Ryan Anderson. He should be in surgery. Even so, the response I got was, "There's no Dr. Anderson here. There never has been." What then? At that point, I passed out. It seemed I had a dream while unconscious. It was as if I was looking back on my life. My parents were wealthy, and I never had to worry about money as a child. After graduating from university, I worked as an employee. It was during that time, at a mixer thrown by a friend, that I met my husband. At the time, my husband was in his first year of residency, and his salary was very low. He would apologetically say he had no money when we went on dates. I was working, and if I ran out of pocket money, I could just ask my parents for more. So, I always paid for our dates. "Sorry, I'll be able to cover the dates soon. Don't worry about it. I work, and money is not an issue for me." But years passed, and he remained poor. His parents were poor, and I couldn't even imagine their level of living. After we got married, he sent money to his parents every month. I suggested living together to ease their life, but he refused. "No, my mom and dad like their house." "Why? That house is quite old?" "For you maybe, but for my parents, it's a house of memories. They've lived there since their newlywed days. And that's where our family history is etched." In the end, my in-laws never moved from their old house, and most of my husband's salary went to them. I couldn't rely on his salary. "Sorry, my parents are poor, so I have to give most of my salary to them. That means we really have little for ourselves." I never realized how strange it was. And I even felt proud of my husband for supporting his parents. When I told my parents about this, they were impressed by what a great person he was. So, I never doubted he was a wonderful person. But the truth was, life was hard, and for the first time, I experienced having no money. When I consulted with my parents, they decided to help out of love for their daughter. But telling my husband would hurt his pride. So out of consideration, I said nothing to him. I worked for him, pleaded to my parents for him, and did everything I could for him. I thought I was happy. Everything was for my husband. Yet, one day, a woman came and I was shattered. Completely, both body and soul. When I regained consciousness, I was apparently crying. The futon was wet, and tears streamed down my cheeks. I thought, was that a dream? It felt so real. It was like a dream telling me that my past self had been betrayed. If not for that, I might never have admitted to being betrayed. It was betrayal, that woman was his mistress, and I had been deceived all along. The worst. For 4 years. Even before we married, so 5 years. I have been deceived all along. He wasn't even working, so sending money to his parents was also a lie. I involved my parents and was just being used by him. And yet, I never realized it. I was a clown. The agony welled up, and I felt a pain in my chest as if being stabbed with needles. I could do nothing about this torment. My husband appeared, nonchalant as if nothing had happened. Why has it come to this? I couldn't sort out my feelings, let alone tell him the truth. If I did, our relationship would be over. Part of me wanted to break up, and part of me didn't. A stranger came by, and while we were talking, she hit me. Why would you let a stranger into our house? What about Emma? Was Emma okay? Emma was taken to the amusement park by her grandparents since the morning. I see, she was okay. Good. How are you doing? Can't you tell? You were hit? Just bruises? It's not just bruises. I wouldn't be hospitalized just for that. Is that so? I was hit on the head with a dish. You're a doctor, you should know how serious that is. Yes, that's right. Ah. I have patients waiting, so I must go. My husband, unable to answer, left the hospital room in a hurry. I thought, I knew it, he's not a doctor. Liar. As I lay in bed staring blankly at the ceiling, my parents walked in with my child. My mother, not expecting that her daughter would be hospitalized while they were at the amusement park, burst into tears as soon as she saw me. Julia. Poor thing. It must have been scary, right? Mom. What happened to make it come to this? What exactly happened? Ryan's woman came. What? What do you mean? Are you saying Ryan was cheating? Hey, why don't you take Emma to the shop or something? Ah, yes, that's a good idea. My father, sensing this was not a conversation for a young child, asked my mother to step out. Once my daughter and wife had left the room, I began to tell my father everything. She came out of nowhere and said she wanted me to break up with him. But I couldn't just do that, and I told her it wasn't that simple. Maybe she got angry because things didn't go her way. She suddenly started hitting me. And with a coffee cup, she hit me on the head. With a coffee cup? Yes. It seems my brain is okay, so I'll be fine. But I will need to stay in the hospital for a while. So, I'm asking you to take care of Emma. That's fine, but what are you going to do from now on? What will I do? Are you going to break up with Ryan? I don't know what to do. Dad, what should I do? If it were up to me, I'd want you to break up. He's put you in danger. And with that kind of woman involved, who knows what she could do to Emma? Ah, you're right. I should think about Emma. There have been too many lies. That's right. Thank you, Dad. I will get a divorce. Good, then leave the rest to me. It wouldn't be fun to just break up without making a point. Thinking deeply, my father said he was going to the shop and left the room. Until my discharge, my husband did not visit. And my parents and I steadily prepared for the divorce. As the day of my discharge approached, I was determined to get a divorce. Furthermore, I became increasingly resentful towards my husband, who hadn't visited even once and hadn't even asked about our daughter. Despite this, I decided to return home for now, but when I got there, my husband was nowhere to be found. Moreover, it was clear from how neat the house was that a woman had been there. I thought, unforgivable. He had a woman in this house. I gathered some personal belongings and returned to my parents' home. At night, I received a call from my husband. He must have known today was my discharge day. And yet, instead of coming to pick me up, he had not replied earlier. Now, he was calling to ask why I wasn't home. Julia, you were discharged today, right? That's right. Why aren't you at home? I'm at my parents' house. Why are you at your parents' house? I wonder why. It's not a matter of I wonder why, come back home. Do you have any idea how worried I am? Worried? If you were worried, you could have visited me in the hospital. How can you say you're worried when you only visited once? I was busy with work, I couldn't help it. Oh, really? Well, I'll be staying here for a while. What? Without saying anything further, I hung up the phone. Then my husband came flying over. Now of all times. When he arrived, he acted as if nothing had happened and started to talk about taking our daughter and going back home. But my parents wouldn't allow it. Julia has just been discharged from the hospital. What are you planning to make her do by immediately taking her back home? What? If you were a doctor, you'd understand what this means. But there's something we need to talk about, so sit down. Honey, please take care of Emma. Yes. My mother took my daughter to another room, while my husband's smile stiffened. It's scary how angry you look. What's going on with both of you? There's nothing funny here. In this situation, it's you who seems to be out of your mind for laughing. What do you mean, this situation? Do you even understand why I was hospitalized? Yeah, some unknown woman came in, right? The issue is who that woman is. Huh? If she's unknown, then she's unknown. She said she was your girlfriend. That's why she asked me to break up with you. Huh? That must be some misunderstanding. Do you think I'd get hurt like this over a misunderstanding? No, that's a mistake. That woman must be crazy. Why would I be with another woman? That's impossible. A crazy woman? Yeah, that's right. She must be a stalker or something. I've felt like I've been watched recently, so I was trying to keep you safe from harm. But I never imagined she'd do something like this. Are you serious about that? Of course. There's no way I could be cheating. Really? So, about being a doctor at the general hospital, is that true? Of course. I'm a surgeon at the general hospital. That's strange. The hospital you work at is the one I was admitted to, right? What? When I rushed in and asked them to call my husband, they said there was no doctor named Anderson. They said there never had been. What? My husband looked perplexed and tilted his head as if something was wrong. If you really are a doctor at that hospital, why didn't you show your face at all while I was admitted? Ah, I hadn't told you, but I was transferred from that general hospital to another one a bit further away. I couldn't visit because I was busy every day. I hardly even came home. That's also strange. The coffee cup that should have been on the floor, and the coffee stains that should have been on the carpet were all cleaned up. I thought it would be tough for you when you came back. So I cleaned that up myself. That's another lie, isn't it? It's not a lie. You lie as easily as you breathe. I'm telling you it's not a lie. What's wrong? Did getting hit in the head mess you up? I was told at the hospital that there has never been a surgeon named Anderson there. That's just because the nurse you asked didn't know. Not everyone knows who I am. Even though you're both in surgery? Could that really happen? It's a big hospital. Then show me your medical license. What? I don't have that on me. You don't have it? That's right. I have something like a license, but it's too big to carry around. No, you're supposed to carry something like a license with you. What? Here, like this. My father showed his smartphone screen, and my husband froze and thought for a while. Then he said, that thing. I keep it safe at home because it would be terrible if I lost it. My father swiped the screen a few times. Then he showed the screen titled Medical Qualification Verification Search. It seems you're not there. That means you're a fake doctor. That must be just a registration error. What nonsense are you spouting? If it's a registration error, how can you work at a general hospital? Wouldn't the hospital check whether you're a real doctor? No. It really is a registration error. These things happen. Dad, aren't you unfamiliar with IT? After all, it's humans who do the registering. These things happen. How far will you go in denying it? Then tell me about the money you've been sending to your parents. I've been hearing all these great things, but perhaps that's a lie too? That's not true. It's all real. Is that so? I've had you investigated, and it turns out you attended school. Through correspondence for both high school and college. I was told it was a famous university's medical school, but it was completely different. A correspondence school that no one knows, and you were almost a shut-in. At some point, your mother, fed up with your inability to do anything, tried to make you work a part-time job, but that didn't go well either. Since then, you've given up on working. Though you said you worked, it lasted only about a week. Is that so? I was shocked by these new facts, and as I looked at my husband, his face turned from pale to red, like a traffic light. Your parents continued to work for your sake, and eventually, your father passed away from the stress. Yet, you refused to leave your room. Later, in place of your father, your mother worked desperately. But her income was low, and life became more difficult. Yet she worked hard, came home, cooked, and collapsed into bed every day. Even seeing your mother like that, you never changed, never left the house. At 25, thinking that you couldn't go on like this and would end up alone in the future, you decided you had to marry. You looked for a woman who would support you and attended a mixer. That's where you met Julia. You lied about being a doctor, deceived her, and succeeded in marrying her. How can you say such things? Even if you're my father-in-law, that's defamation. Then my father took out an envelope marked Detective Agency. This envelope contains an investigation report about you. Everything I've just said comes from that investigation. How can you say it's true? The investigation could be wrong. Even the most capable detective can't uncover every detail of a person's past. My father took out his smartphone again and tapped the screen. The voice that came from the phone was my mother-in-law's. That boy has never worked a day in his life. He got married, and it seems he's getting by somehow, so I'm finally relieved. Sending money home? Never happened. Not once since he got married. He's never worked, so it must be Julia's earnings that are keeping them going. There'd be no way to send money home. Stop it. Detectives might not know your past, but surely your own parents would? I've heard a lot, and they told me just what the detectives did. And that there has never been any money sent home. Wow, I was surprised. You've deceived not only Julia and us, but even your own parents. My husband turned pale and trembled. It seemed like a complete knockout, but my father did not ease up on him. Now, shall we get to the main point? The main point? It seems you have a mistress, not a stalker. No, that's not true. She's a stalker. No matter how much you insist, it's useless. It's all written in the investigation report. Surely, she must be in cahoots with the detective. Is that so? Then how will you explain this? My father pulled several photos from the envelope. They showed the woman who hit me walking arm in arm with my husband. Both of them coming out of a hotel. And the two of them looking outside from the woman's apartment. There were too many scenes just like these. How will you explain this evidence? That woman is crazy. She kept coming on to me persistently. So, I promised Julia I wouldn't get close to her. And was just trying to keep the woman appeased. Is that so? The only person I love is Julia. Ignoring my husband's desperate attempts to explain. My father stood up and opened the door to the next room. Out came Michelle, the mistress who had hit me. Ah. Michelle. Why are you here? Why? Why are you here? You said we were going to get married, right? Yet, you call me a stalker? You always said your love for your wife was fading. And that you wanted to get back together? No, You said you were a doctor, that you were a resident with no money, right? That your wife took all your salary, so you had no money. That's why I've been helping you out with what little salary I get. And yet, you weren't even a doctor, nor did you have any intention of leaving your wife. I believed you and confronted your wife. That's going too far. If I hadn't done that, I'd still be deceived by you. Michelle, do you really want to marry this man? Of course. I've been with him for a long time and decided to live for him. No, it's not true. I never intended to leave Julia. How cruel. You don't want to leave your wife? So everything you told me was a lie? No, it wasn't a lie. I was serious about that. But it's also true that I don't want to leave my wife. That's unacceptable. I even gave you pocket money. You said you'd pay me back once your residency was over and your salary increased. You asked me to bear with it for now. That's true, but if being a doctor was a lie, how were you planning to pay me back? Well, I thought Michelle would understand. Understand what? Maybe, if I said I got fired as a doctor, it would somehow work out. So you were planning to deceive me again? Continue to be with me as a mistress while staying married to your wife? Don't think of it that way. It's better if we just enjoy our time together without thinking about marriage. I wanted to get married. I wanted to be your wife. Marrying you means divorcing Julia. Doing that would mean I can't access Julia's inheritance. She's a wealthy heiress. Staying married to her is much more profitable than marrying you. Ah, I see. So that's why you married Julia, with all those lies. The worst. To think it was all for my father's inheritance from the start. No, that's not it. It's just sophistry to convince Michelle. Sophistry? So you do prefer your wife over me? Michelle, let me ask you again. Even now, do you still want to marry this man? Of course. No matter how many times you ask, my feelings won't change. Well, that's good to hear. Then here's the divorce paper. Julia, Ryan, sign it. What? No, I don't want a divorce. Whether you sign it now or later, it'll happen. I can hire a lawyer. This is. I picked up the pen and wrote down my name. Now it's your turn. My father placed the divorce paper in front of my husband. And although he resisted, he agreed to the divorce. Now, this is next. The marriage certificate. Even if you submit the divorce paper, you can't submit the marriage certificate right away. You have to wait until the divorce is recognized. That's about 2 weeks. But if I let you two write the marriage certificate after becoming a couple, this man might not write it. So, sign now. This is. You've already signed the divorce paper. No matter how much you resist, the result will be the same. With trembling hands, my husband signed the marriage certificate. And Michelle signed it happily. Now you two are married. Congratulations. What a situation. I was managing everything so well until now. From now on, you are mine alone. Ryan, I will be claiming compensation and child support. What? But I don't have any money. Whether you have money or not, it's only natural to claim it. After all, you had a mistress. It costs money to raise Emma. That's not fair, Father. Aren't you wealthy? You have more than enough, even without taking from a poor man like me. That's a different matter. If you don't have money, borrow it and pay in full. In full. How much will it be? Emma is only 2 years old. You'll pay until Emma graduates from university, for the next 20 years. Pay $500 each month. You can calculate how much that will be. How am I supposed to borrow that much? I'm unemployed, who would lend to me? There are plenty of places that will lend to you. Borrowing isn't only about going through reputable sources. That's something for you as a couple to figure out. And Michelle, be prepared because I'll be billing you too. Yes. Since I'm getting married, I'll pay properly. What should I do? Michelle, you pay my share. Ryan, if you have debts, you have to work. Maybe this will finally motivate you to start working. Then you can live a human life. That's right. Michelle, you're something else. Maybe you're better for this man than anyone. Ryan, this might be your last chance for rehabilitation. Work hard and pay it back. But I don't want to work. Well, that's the end of it, you can go home now. No, there's still more. What about the division of assets? The house and car. And other household appliances. I'm entitled to half. You've hardly contributed to the living expenses all this time. The little you did contribute sometimes was money you received from Michelle, wasn't it? You think you could buy a house or car under those circumstances? Everything was bought with money my father helped us with. So the house and the car are my father's. There's nothing for you. That's ridiculous. What about clothes, suits, shoes? Those were also bought by my father, so I'll have them disposed of. Why even those? Just buy them again. It's not a joke, you know. Some of those suits cost thousands of dollars. Give it up. It's your fault for not working. Besides, you've been lying all along. Now you'll have to straighten up for her. Ah, what a situation. Don't worry, I'm here for you. I'll support you so you can work properly. But I won't let you cheat ever again. Michelle said this with a creepy smile. Ryan, oblivious to Michelle's demeanor, was slumped in shock. Later, Ryan moved into the apartment where his mistress lived, but was unable to borrow money as he had hoped. So, Michelle borrowed the money in her name and paid it off in one go. But this was the beginning of hell for him. Michelle, who had always been kind no matter what, revealed an unbelievable true nature. She whipped Ryan into shape for not doing anything around the house, arguing that a man who can't handle household chores couldn't possibly work. While teaching him every household task, she made him look for work. If Ryan didn't move as Michelle wanted, she wouldn't let him eat properly that day. He who does not work, neither shall he eat. That was her principle. Once Ryan finally found a part-time job, Michelle quit her job. Her reason was that she couldn't be sure if he was really working. So she drove him to and from work. Indeed, while saying he was going to work, he might have been messing around with another woman. She never took her eyes off Ryan for a minute, and he was deprived of any freedom. Moreover, she didn't give him any pocket money, and when he went to work, he had to bring a water bottle and a hot dog. The hot dog also had a red heart drawn over the sausage to mark Michelle's presence. Thanks to that, they are managing to make the monthly payments. So it's all thanks to Michelle. However, Ryan has become quite thin and seems to have lost his sanity. Meanwhile, I returned to my parents' house and am living happily with my parents and child. Recently, I've been helping with my father's work, making my social debut and enjoying every day.
Looking back, it's almost hard to believe how different my life was just a few years ago. I'm Emma, and I'm 32 now. But let me take you back to when everything seemed so much simpler and yet so much more complicated than I ever imagined. I was teaching middle school in Portland, Oregon, a job that I genuinely loved. My days were filled with the familiar routine of lesson plans, grading papers, and those occasional moments of inspiration when a student finally grasps a concept. Outside of school, my life was quiet. I enjoyed solitary walks in the park, curled up with a good book on rainy afternoons, and the peace of a small, orderly apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I was content. Everything started to change the day Alex walked into my life. I remember it vividly. He came into the school library, asking for recommendations on books that could help with a project he was working on. At first glance, he seemed charming, with his easy smile and confident demeanor. But it was his interest in me, not just the books, that caught me off guard. "Hi, I'm Alex," he said, extending his hand. "I could use some help finding the right materials for a presentation. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" His casual tone and the way he looked at me, as if I were the only person in the room, made me nervous. I wasn't used to such attention, but I found myself eager to assist him. Our conversation was light and pleasant, and Alex's enthusiasm about the subject made the interaction enjoyable. Over the next few weeks, Alex became a regular visitor at the library. He often brought me coffee and engaged in cheerful conversation. I found myself looking forward to our chats. He would tell me about his day, his interests, and gradually, I began to share more about myself. It was strange how quickly I grew comfortable with him, something that hadn't happened in a long time. Eventually, Alex asked me out. "How about we grab dinner this Friday?" "I'd love to continue our conversation outside the library," he suggested. I hesitated at first. My life was predictable, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for a change. But Alex's sincerity and warmth persuaded me. I agreed, and that was the beginning of a whirlwind I wasn't prepared for. Our dates were filled with laughter and exploration of Portland. We visited local eateries, walked along the waterfront, and even attended a few cultural events. With each passing day, I found myself more drawn to him. He had a way of making me feel special, something I hadn't experienced in years. The more time we spent together, the more I felt like I was discovering a part of myself that had been buried under years of solitude. The relationship quickly grew serious. Alex proposed one evening during a quiet dinner, his eyes sparkling with affection. "Emma, I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" His proposal was simple yet heartfelt, and overwhelmed by my feelings for him, I said yes. It wasn't long before I met Alex's parents, Diana and Robert. I had heard a lot about them from Alex, but nothing prepared me for the reality. They were older, Diana being 65 and Robert the same age, and their presence was imposing. Their home was grand, filled with opulence and a certain coldness that made me uncomfortable. "Emma, it's a pleasure to meet you," Diana said, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Robert's greeting was equally formal, his handshake firm but distant. They scrutinized me with a gaze that seemed to assess my worthiness. The initial meetings were strained. They seemed to disapprove of my background, my job as a teacher, and even my simple attire. Despite Alex's reassurances, I felt uneasy. It was clear that Diana and Robert had expectations that I didn't meet. Things took a turn for the worse when Diana and Robert insisted on a prenuptial agreement. "It's just a formality," Diana insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We want to ensure that everything is handled properly." Signing the agreement was a blow to my self-esteem. It made me feel distrusted and undervalued. Yet, out of love for Alex and a hope that things would get better, I reluctantly agreed. We had a modest wedding ceremony, and soon after, I moved into Alex's house. Life at the house was different from what I had imagined. Diana and Robert made frequent visits, each one more uncomfortable than the last. They treated me as though I were an outsider, and Alex, instead of defending me, seemed to join in their disapproving attitude. I found myself feeling increasingly isolated and undervalued in what was supposed to be my new home. Then came the turning point in our story, an inheritance from my great-aunt. She left me a substantial fortune, including $15 million, shares in various companies, and a grand estate. The moment the news broke, Alex and his parents' demeanor changed drastically. Their previously cold attitude turned into excessive attentiveness and care, which only made me more suspicious. It was then that I started to see the cracks in the facade. The way Alex and his parents suddenly showered me with affection seemed too calculated. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. Once I moved into Alex's house, I expected things to settle into a new routine, but life had other plans. The grand estate seemed beautiful at first, spacious rooms and elegant decor, but it quickly felt like a gilded cage. The more I settled in, the more I felt the weight of Diana and Robert's disapproval. Alex's parents continued their frequent visits, and each time, I felt more like a stranger in my own home. Diana had a way of subtly undermining me, making comments about the way I managed the household or how I interacted with the staff. Robert's criticisms were more direct. He would often express his disappointment in hushed tones, though loud enough for me to hear. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Diana made her usual visit. She walked into the kitchen with a stern expression. "Emma, the housekeeper mentioned you've been asking her for advice on managing the household. Shouldn't you know how to do this yourself?" I was taken aback. "I'm sorry if I've been a bother," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just thought it would be helpful to get her input on how things work here." Diana's eyes narrowed. Well, let's hope you're not too dependent on others. After all, a good wife should manage these things efficiently. Her comment stung, but I forced a smile and went about my work. Alex wasn't much help in these situations. When I tried to discuss my feelings with him, he would dismiss my concerns, saying things like, "They're just old-fashioned. You know how my parents are. Don't let them get to you." I wanted to believe him, but it was hard to ignore the growing sense of unease. Then, one day, the reality of our situation took a darker turn. I had been busy at school when I received a call from a lawyer. My great-aunt had passed away, leaving me a substantial inheritance. The details were overwhelming: a fortune of $15 million, shares in several major companies, and a grand estate. At first, I was in shock, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how this inheritance would change our lives. I hoped it would improve things, but it seemed like the opposite was happening. The moment Alex and his parents learned about the inheritance, their behavior toward me shifted dramatically. Alex became unusually attentive. He was suddenly very interested in my daily activities, always asking about my plans and trying to be more involved in everything I did. Diana and Robert also began treating me with an exaggerated kindness. Diana would drop by with gifts and try to engage in friendly conversations, while Robert seemed to make an effort to be more cordial, even offering to help with some of the estate's affairs. Despite their sudden change in attitude, I remained cautious. Their previous behavior had left a deep impression, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My suspicions were confirmed one evening when I overheard a conversation between Alex and his parents. I had been working late in the study, and the door was slightly ajar. I heard Alex's voice, low and conspiratorial. "We need to get Emma to have a child soon. It's the best way to secure our share of her inheritance." Diana's voice was just as cold. "We'll need to be careful. If she starts to feel pressured, she might back out. We need to make it seem like it's her idea." I felt my heart drop. The betrayal was crushing. They weren't interested in me for who I was. They were only interested in the wealth I brought into the relationship. The realization hit me hard, and I knew I had to make a decision. The following day, I confronted Alex. "I heard your conversation last night. I need to know what's going on." Alex's face turned pale. He stammered, trying to come up with excuses, but I could see through his lies. "It's not what you think," he said weakly. "We were just talking about future plans." I wasn't buying it. "I know what I heard. I can't be part of this anymore." That was the turning point. I realized that my relationship with Alex was built on deception and manipulation. I had to take control of my life, no matter how difficult it was. I started making plans for my next steps. The first thing I did was consult with a lawyer about my inheritance and ensure that my assets were protected. I also began preparing myself emotionally and mentally for what was to come. The journey ahead was going to be challenging, but I was determined to stand up for myself and reclaim my life from the grip of deception. It was clear that I needed to regain my independence and redefine my self-worth, away from the shadows of betrayal. I couldn't stay in that house a moment longer. The more I thought about Alex and his parents' schemes, the clearer it became that I needed to act quickly and decisively. It wasn't just about my inheritance. It was about reclaiming my life and self-worth. The day after our confrontation, I moved out of Alex's house. The process was both liberating and daunting. I packed my essentials, leaving behind the luxury of the grand estate for a modest apartment in downtown Portland. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The small space was cozy and intimate, a stark contrast to the opulence I had come from. But it was a fresh start, and I needed that. I also began working with a lawyer to handle my inheritance. I wanted to make sure that Alex and his parents wouldn't have any claim to it. The legalities were complex, but I was determined to see it through. The $15 million I inherited, along with the shares and estate, needed to be secured properly. The thought of losing it to their manipulative schemes was unacceptable. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I made plans to use part of my inheritance for good. I started by donating a significant portion to charities that supported education and women's empowerment. It felt like a way to turn my painful experience into something positive. I also had a dream that had been on the back burner for years, a bookstore. I had always loved books and wanted to create a space where others could share that passion. With the financial stability my inheritance provided, I decided to make that dream a reality. I found a quaint location in a lively part of town, and soon enough, my bookstore was taking shape. Starting a bookstore wasn't just about business. It was about healing. I poured my energy into creating a warm, welcoming space filled with books and community events. It became a place where I could connect with others who shared my love for literature. It was therapeutic to see people find joy and inspiration in the same way I did. But the emotional journey was just as important. I started attending therapy sessions to help me process everything that had happened. Talking through my feelings helped me gain clarity and strength. I learned to confront my fears and embrace my own worth without letting the past define me. One day, as I was setting up a book display in my store, I received an unexpected visitor, Diana. She walked in, her demeanor as cold as ever. She had always been controlling and manipulative, but seeing her now, I felt a strange mixture of anger and calm. "Emma," she said with forced politeness, "I came to see how you're doing. Alex and I were concerned about you." I looked at her with guarded eyes. "I'm doing just fine, Diana. I'm getting back on my feet and focusing on what's important to me now." Diana's smile faltered. "I hope you're not holding any grudges. After all, Alex and I were only trying to ensure the best for you and for our family." Her words were infuriating, but I managed to keep my composure. "It's clear to me now that you were never interested in what was best for me. You were only interested in what you could gain." Diana's face tightened, and she left the store abruptly. It was the closure I needed. I didn't need their validation or approval anymore. I had found my path and was moving forward, one step at a time. As I settled into my new life, I found a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The betrayal from Alex and his family had been painful, but it had also been a catalyst for my personal growth. I learned to trust myself and embrace my independence fully. The journey wasn't over, but I had come a long way from where I started. My bookstore was thriving, and I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not for what I had. I had regained control of my destiny and rediscovered my self-worth. My bookstore quickly became a community hub, and it was more than I had ever dreamed. Every day, as I greeted customers and engaged with fellow book lovers, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was my space, created from my dreams and resilience, and it was thriving. It was a place where I could share my passion for literature and foster connections with others who appreciated the same things I did. I continued to invest in causes close to my heart. The charitable donations I made with my inheritance were changing lives, and knowing that I was making a positive impact in the world was incredibly fulfilling. It gave me a sense of purpose beyond my personal recovery and reminded me that my experience, however painful, could lead to something meaningful. Despite the positive changes in my life, there were still moments of reflection. One evening, as I was closing the bookstore, I found myself looking back on everything that had happened. I had faced betrayal and manipulation, but those experiences had shaped me into a stronger and more self-assured person. It was bittersweet to acknowledge how much I had grown, but I was proud of my resilience. I remember one particular day when I sat in my small but charming apartment, sipping coffee and reflecting on my journey. I felt a sense of completeness that had eluded me for so long. My life was now filled with purpose and joy, far removed from the deceit and control I had once endured. One evening, as I hosted a small book reading event at the store, I took a moment to look around at the faces of the people who had come to support me. I realized that I had built a new community of friends and supporters who valued me for who I was, not for what I had. The sense of belonging and appreciation I felt was a stark contrast to the cold indifference of Alex and his parents. As the night ended and I closed up the store, I raised a toast to myself. It was a simple gesture, but it represented so much more. It was a celebration of my journey from betrayal to empowerment, from heartbreak to happiness. I embraced the uncertainties of the future with confidence, knowing that I had the strength to face whatever came my way. In my quiet moments, I often think about how far I've come. I've learned to trust my instincts and value myself. My experiences, though painful, led me to rediscover my true self and find a life that is fulfilling and authentic. I've learned that true strength comes from within, and that no matter how dark the path may seem, there is always light at the end. As I continue on this journey, I hold onto the lessons I've learned and look forward to the future with hope and excitement. My life is now a testament to resilience and self-worth, and I am ready to face whatever lies ahead with an open heart and unwavering confidence. Here's to new beginnings and to the endless possibilities that await.
Pay back everything, will you? Well, if you do that, you'll be a welfare beggar in the near future. Prepare yourself because I'll also demand compensation. I clenched my fist tightly. Yet, I managed to hold back my anger and said with a smile, "Got it." Indeed, such things need to be settled, right? Then, make sure you check the exact amount I've used, okay? After that, I gave him my address and hurried back home. Phil probably thought I had run away seeing me like that, but I wasn't running away. When Phil contacted me next, I was ready to end everything. That day came much sooner than expected, just 3 days after I saw Phil again. Right away, Phil started bombarding me with urgent calls. But even when I answered, Phil just kept repeating the same words over and over. It seemed that we couldn't resolve anything unless we met in person. So we met again, and there Phil exclaimed, "Why? How? Is this really your house?" The reason for his panic on the phone seemed to be my house. In front of my mansion, Phil truly seemed to have lost his mind. My name is Stacy Manning. Currently, I am a 40-year-old housewife. I met my husband Phil 6 years ago. Introduced by the president of the company I was working for at the time. The president loved to go fishing. One day, while fishing, it seems he met Phil, who had come with a friend by chance. Phil was not interested in fishing. So he apparently spent the time talking with the president, who was there alone. Knowing that he was single, the president thought of me. The reason was that I had lost my parents early and was all alone in the world. Feeling sorry for me, the president, who always looked after me, thought Phil and I could become a family. I couldn't refuse the president's kindness, and when we met, Phil somehow took a liking to me. Thus, we started dating and eventually got married. Now, I have quit my job and become a full-time housewife. Phil was a very kind person. My in-laws were wonderful, too, treating me just like their real daughter, and for me, who had lost my parents, they were like real parents. Phil's house was a duplex. The in-laws had built it new when they got married, and after Phil's grandparents passed away. One half of the duplex became vacant, so Phil and I moved in there. Although we lived separately, we often saw my in-laws and had a good relationship with them. However, there was one discomfort I couldn't quite get rid of regarding the relationship between Phil and my in-laws. Apparently, Phil's father had become ill a few years ago and was living in a wheelchair. Phil seemed not to care about his father at all. For example, the day we first met face to face. When we arrived at the designated restaurant, a man in a wheelchair couldn't get over a step and was struggling. I helped him over that step. Later, I learned that the man was Phil's father. At that time, my mother-in-law had told Phil to stay with his father and went to the restroom. Despite that, Phil had left his father alone and gone to the restroom as well. Phil. I told you to stay with your dad. Where were you? Mother-in-law said, but there was no sign of remorse in Phil. I felt a moment of discomfort, but Phil praised me, saying, "Indeed, Stacy is a wonderful woman. Even though she didn't know he was my father, she helped him." I momentarily forgot the discomfort I felt. Looking back now, there were many such incidents. After all, I wasn't informed beforehand that Phil's father was wheelchair-bound. Nor did I question why a restaurant with many steps was chosen. Recently, while dining with 4 people, Phil suddenly suggested, "Why don't we try mountain climbing?" I was taken aback. In any case, Phil showed no consideration for his father. Phil. Isn't it thoughtless to suggest such a thing when your father can barely walk? I told Phil that the night he suggested the mountain climb. However, he just laughed. Dad can't make it. I know that. He just doesn't have to come. Even if he doesn't come, it's too much to leave him alone. It's cruel to suggest a trip he can't even take. Then, Stacy, you can stay and keep him company. I was dumbfounded by his words. No matter what I argued, Phil never seemed to listen. Each time Phil spoke, I continued to feel guilty towards his father. However, the story didn't end there. One day, forgetting such a conversation, Phil suddenly said he was going on a trip just with his mother. Since Stacy is here, Dad will be fine, right? Leaving those words behind, he really went away with his mother. My mother-in-law thought I had agreed, saying, "Stacy, call me if anything happens. Thank you for this time." She smiled happily, so I couldn't say anything. After silently seeing them off, I apologized to Phil's father for his son's selfish actions. "Thank you for always caring. It's my fault for getting sick. So you don't have to worry, Stacy." Father-in-law said so with a smile. That smile somewhat comforted me, but I still felt uneasy as I awaited Phil's return. After that, whether it was lunch or dinner, Phil planned numerous trips, always going out just with his mother. But I always feel bad for Stacy. Mother-in-law would say so, but Phil responded kindly. Normally, Mom takes care of him, right? It's fine once in a while. Stacy says so, too. I certainly don't recall saying such things, but I cannot deny them either. Every time the two of them went out, I was left to take care of my father-in-law and keep him company. I felt sorry for my father-in-law, and it seemed he felt sorry for me as well. Then, 2 years later, my father-in-law finally passed away. At the funeral, engulfed in sorrow, I heard Phil's unbelievable remark. "Finally freed. An old man in a wheelchair is nothing but a burden." Well, but someone appeared to take that burden, so it was good I didn't have to do anything. It seems like Mom was saved thanks to him, better him than no one. I trembled with anger. Such a kind father-in-law is called a burden? And someone to bear that burden? It was the moment I finally understood what Phil really thought of me. He must have enjoyed the trips with his beloved mother. He ignored the feelings of my father-in-law and me during those times. Even though I wanted children, Phil had said, I still want it to be just the two of us. But we hardly had any time just the two of us. It must have been an excuse, thinking that if I got pregnant and gave birth, I wouldn't be able to take care of him. I was so frustrated and ashamed that I cried quietly by myself, but this was a funeral. I was grateful that everyone left me alone as I cried. Of course, my mother-in-law probably didn't mean that. At the funeral, my mother-in-law's sad face didn't seem like an act. I understood that she was happy being invited by Phil, and she always brought me souvenirs. Of course, my mother-in-law needed to reflect on her actions too. But it seemed she also had regrets since my father-in-law had passed away. But, if Phil had thought it through more, he wouldn't have dragged my mother-in-law into such a whirlpool of regret. The more I thought of him as the root cause of everything, the more unforgivable it seemed. Since that incident, we became a couple only by name. We talked in front of my mother-in-law to avoid worrying her. But when it was just the two of us, we were like air to each other. Eventually, I didn't even care whether Phil was at home or not. Presumably, he was out with my mother-in-law, and now that my father-in-law was gone, I had no right to say anything. However, one day, Phil was not at home, but my mother-in-law was. Huh? Mother, you're not with Phil today? At those words, my mother-in-law tilted her head. What do you mean? Since your father passed away, I haven't gone out with him. I've made it clear to refuse. Huh? I told him to treasure you more than me. Phil agreed and said he would take good care of his wife. I was shocked at those words. Taking care of his wife? He didn't even talk to me, yet he said such things to please my mother-in-law. I said, I'm sorry to say this, but there's no love between us anymore. Taking care of his wife is out of the question. I can't imagine Phil taking care of his wife. That's so. My mother-in-law seemed genuinely shocked by this revelation. But I couldn't stand it anymore. Even pretending to be a happy couple was painful. But then, where is Phil going? He's hardly ever home anymore, day or night. Indeed. I thought he was always out with you. We looked at each other. Now that we realized we both thought he was with the other, where was Phil really going? That day, I confronted Phil when he returned home late. You're late. Where have you been until this time? Phil stopped dead when I spoke to him. He hadn't expected me to say anything when it was just the two of us. I was out dining with Mom. Phil mumbled his answer, obviously a big lie. If he was with his mother, I wouldn't have said anything. Knowing this, he must have used that excuse. But not today. If it was with your mother, she was actually at home. Which mother did you dine with? What's with that tone? It sounds so sarcastic. Sarcastic? You're the one who lied, what do you think? I retorted to Phil. Phil sighed heavily and then said to me, does it matter where? I deserve a break once in a while. A break? You hardly come home after work, and on your days off, you're always out. You pushed the care of your father onto me even when he was alive. I snapped, raising my voice. Phil seemed to have something on his mind in response to my words. But since it was true, he couldn't retort. Desperate, Phil also raised his voice.
Ah.
Shut up, you nag. Mom likes you, so even though you were no longer needed, I kept you here. If you have so many complaints, just leave. Such terrible words. But I desperately controlled my anger. Thinking I had nothing to say, Phil said triumphantly. You'd be in trouble, right? Where would a housewife with no relatives go if I threw you out, huh? But you defied me. I have no reason to support you anymore. As the insults continued, my heart nearly broke. I didn't regret complaining to Phil. I didn't expect him to understand. But he had no right to say these things. If you're leaving, that's perfect. There's another woman who wants to marry me. I wouldn't be troubled if a woman like you disappeared. What? Are you saying you've been cheating? I, who had been silent, returned words at that. Cheating? Don't accuse me of anything I haven't done. But you just said there's a woman who wants to marry you.
Yeah.
I'm serious. It's a good opportunity for you to leave and for me to remarry. And so, we ended up getting divorced. Only my mother-in-law kept crying and apologizing, which made my eyes well up too. From meeting at 35 to divorcing at 40, I think I truly wasted some precious years. But from here on, I think of it as a new life and I'm determined to do my best. About a year after the divorce, I finally got used to my new life and regained a peaceful existence. The president of my previous company, knowing my situation, rehired me. And work was going well. One day, on my way home from work, I stopped at the supermarket. I was tired and reached for half-priced food. Then, I spotted my favorite cheesecake in the discount section and stopped. Just as a familiar voice reached my ears. I thought it was some disgraceful old hag. I looked up at the voice. There was Phil, brazenly peering into my basket and laughing. Lonely, huh? A discounted food, really? It's none of your business. As I grabbed the cheesecake and tried to leave, Phil said. Oh, right. You used Dad's savings, didn't you? Your father's savings? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie. You were buying stuff like diapers when you were taking care of him, right? I was surprised by his words. Of course. Besides, I had permission from his parents for that. They had asked me to buy those things, so there was no reason for Phil to say such things now. That was. I tried to respond, but Phil smirked triumphantly. Pay back everything, will you? Well, if you do that, you'll be a welfare beggar in the near future. Prepare yourself because I'll also demand compensation. I clenched my fist tightly. Yet, I managed to hold back my anger and said with a smile. Got it. Indeed, such things need to be settled, right? Then, make sure you check the exact amount I've used, okay? Putting on a brave face. Phil laughed, but I didn't rise to his provocation. And quickly took out a memo from my bag to write down my address. Also, I live here now. We need to have a discussion, so please contact me later. I quickly finished speaking, handed over the address, and hurried home. Phil probably thought I had run away seeing me like that, but I wasn't running away. The next time Phil contacted me, I was ready to end everything. I had made up my mind. It happened just 3 days after our reunion. I was at work. Suddenly, I noticed that Phil had been calling me repeatedly. I wondered if something had happened. Just then, another call came in. I hurriedly answered, thinking something might have happened to my mother-in-law. Hello? What's going on? Over the phone, Phil shouted. What is this? What? I'm outside your house right now. What the hell is going on? I didn't understand what he meant. But Phil was muttering something, almost in a frenzy. Had he gone mad? Though I felt his madness, I asked calmly again. You're in front of my house? I'm sorry, but I'm at work. Are you talking about the discussion? I don't care about the discussion. What do you mean by all this? We were completely at odds. I sighed deeply. It seemed that nothing had happened to my mother-in-law, at least. We can't resolve this over the phone, let's meet and talk. I'll be home in 3 hours. I said this while checking my watch and hung up. Phil called a few more times, but I ignored all his calls. When I hurried home after work and approached my house, I saw Phil waiting there. Have you been here all this time? Noticing me, Phil approached with a furious expression and raised his voice. What does this mean? What about? You need to specify. Hearing my words, Phil pointed at my house and opened his mouth again. Why? How? Can you live in such a magnificent house? Phil said this, spitting as he emphasized his words. I recoiled involuntarily. Did you run off with Dad's inheritance? What are you talking about? Of course not. Phil attacked me fiercely, but I brushed it off lightly. It's my parents' money. However, he was not convinced. Your parents? Weren't they long gone? Were you lying? Calm down a bit. Okay? This is the house built with the real estate income inherited from my parents. It's impossible that I stole any money from your parents. Finally, it seemed Phil understood a bit and regained some composure. Yes. It's true that my parents passed away early. However, they came from a family that owned a lot of real estate. And after their deaths, being an only child, I inherited all of it. The income from these properties is a staggering $3 million per year. Money keeps flowing in even without me doing anything. And my total assets amount to several tens of millions of dollars. Of course, I could live comfortably without working. But what I really wanted was something money can't buy: human warmth. The reason I worked was more for the warmth of eating lunch with colleagues or supporting each other through mistakes than for the income. Being completely alone, if I had distanced myself from society just because I had money, I would have truly been alone. When I was married and a housewife, I felt the warm love of my in-laws and was happy. Because of the divorce, I returned to work to maintain my social connections. I explained this to Phil and then added, but if I say I have money, everyone comes flocking for it. I was really happy when Phil liked me without knowing I was so wealthy. Well, probably because I was a caregiver. That is. After hearing my story, Phil regained his composure. At the same time, it seemed he regretted having driven me away. He tried to appear calm, but his face was pale, and his voice trembled. But it wasn't what anyone would do. I thought you looked kind, so I felt I could leave my father in her care confidently. He muttered some plausible excuse and nodded as if to convince himself. By the way, if you had so much money, you should have told me. Why? What difference would it make if I told you, Phil? Well, that is, like managing it. Phil seemed desperate to get involved with the wealth, but it was too late. I smiled slightly and said, if we had had a child, they would have been the ones to inherit it. Too bad, huh? Phil seemed to feel even more regret at my words, but still had no response. I continued, almost like delivering the final blow. It's late today, can we possibly discuss this another time? Was it about settling the caregiving expenses during our marriage? Oh.
Yeah.
That's right, we need to settle that properly. Tormented by regret, Phil seemed to find some hope in my words and briskly looked up. However, the next moment, he would be plunged back into despair. That's great. I paid quite a bit for your father's hospital fees. If I can get reimbursed, that would really help me. What? Phil froze for a moment, turning even paler. Watching his reaction, I rapidly continued. I had covered the hospital fees, right? It was about $10,200 over 3 years. Well, it was my own decision, so let's say just $10,000 is fine. And then, was it about the diapers from your father's savings that I used on my own? I think it was about $1,000, right? So, subtract that, and you just pay me $9,000. I could hardly suppress a laugh as Phil found himself unable to say anything. During the caregiving, my in-laws had said, we feel bad that you're paying for hospital fees, we should at least cover something. I never intended to make my in-laws pay. but I thought it would make my father-in-law feel even more indebted if I covered everything. That's why I had them break into the savings just for the diaper expenses. And even then, it wasn't always for diapers. If assisted, my father-in-law could go to the bathroom. It wasn't a huge amount spent on diapers, but Phil's nitpicking brought about this situation.
Ah.
And about compensation? I'm not sure what compensation you're talking about, but if anyone should receive it, wouldn't it be me, the one who was cheated on? With those words sounding like a final blow, Phil collapsed on the spot. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Then he groveled on the ground, but such an act was meaningless. If you have something to say, we can hear it at the next meeting. I left these words behind, leaving Phil groveling as I returned alone to my large mansion. A few days later, I contacted a lawyer. I doubted he would bother me again. But just to be sure, I wanted to sever all ties with Phil completely. The lawyer listened to my story and acted immediately. When I visited Phil's house for the first time in a year, a young woman came out. May I help you? Is Phil here? I'm his ex-wife. After hearing this, she looked at me with discomfort and went back inside. In her place, Phil came out.
Ah.
Good, you're here. I've called many times without response. So I decided to come directly to your house for a discussion, just like you did. As I said this, Phil began to fumble. So, I apologized, didn't I? What value does your apology have? You contacted me to settle up, right? It might be awkward to be overheard by the neighbors, so I'll come in. Conceding, Phil stepped aside to let me into the house. However, I was shocked by the state of the house I entered for the first time in a year. What is this? The hallway looked as if it hadn't been cleaned in days, with visible footprints in the dust. Used cardboard boxes were left abandoned in the already narrow corridor. Cautiously, I peeked into the living room where the young woman I saw earlier was sprawled on the sofa, absorbed in her smartphone, surrounded by scattered laundry. Phil, trying to prevent me from seeing the state of the living room, hurriedly closed the door. Since Claire is here, I guess this place will do. It appears that the woman from earlier was indeed Claire, Phil's new wife. Phil led me to the entrance and suggested we talk there. I sighed at his words. Given the state of things, it couldn't be helped. What's with all this mess, anyway? I couldn't help but voice my concern. Phil gave a forced laugh and said, well, I just haven't gotten around to cleaning. But it looked more like he never cleaned at all. I had many thoughts but decided not to delve too deeply. Getting involved was the last thing I wanted. Later, the lawyer graciously compiled the details we had discussed into documents. I was seeking a settlement of $9,000 I had spent, and $20,000 in compensation for being driven out due to the affair, totaling $29,000. Like before, Phil turned pale and begged for mercy on his knees. There's no way I can forgive you, I retorted. As we were exchanging words, Claire appeared from the living room. What's all the commotion?
Ah.
What does the ex-wife want? It was getting complicated. I thought so, but if I was to receive compensation, she was not unrelated. The lawyer explained on my behalf. Claire listened silently to the lawyer's explanation. But after everything was explained, she exclaimed loudly, huh? I wondered if the two of them would start making a fuss. But instead, Claire turned to Phil and raised her voice. You're 41 and still such a pathetic man. You've caused trouble, so you should pay up. But no buts. Claire spoke quite reasonably, which surprised me. I'm truly sorry for the inconvenience. I wouldn't have caused such a problem if I had known he was married. Then, she apologized. The lawyer and I exchanged glances, wondering what was happening.
You
didn't know Mr. Phil was married? Of course not. I was deceived. It turns out Phil had been deceiving Claire, who was only 20, telling her he was 35. Claire said that when she first came to this house after I had left, she felt suspicious because there were women's items around. However, she was misled at that time, being told they belonged to his mother. But a few months ago, she had a conversation with a neighbor and finally learned she was the second wife. Unable to bear the deceit, she asked for a divorce. But Phil wouldn't accept it, and she had been neglecting household duties since. It's my fault for being deceived. Claire said this while glaring at Phil, who just smirked. Despite her youth, I couldn't help but feel sympathy for her. Can't we do something for her? I'll pay if it's about money. I asked the lawyer. What? It's none of your business. What are you saying? Phil, who had been smirking, suddenly began to panic. It is my business. I lost 5 years from age 35 to 40. Do you understand how precious those years were to me, someone without children? She's still young. I don't want her to go through what I did. My passion seemed to widen Claire's eyes slightly. Perhaps her stern look was because she had already despaired of life. Understood. It's up to Miss Claire now, the lawyer said, turning to her. Then, with a strained voice, she murmured, I want a divorce. Phil collapsed in despair at Claire's words. He had claimed to be serious about her. If that were truly the case, he should have been honest with her. He was probably only thinking about driving me out and marrying her. Such self-centered behavior was typical of Phil. Is someone here? Just as things were about to be settled, a figure emerged from the back of the house. Mother. Stacy. The mother-in-law appeared much thinner and frail, barely a year since I last saw her. And she came staggering over to me. Then she sat down in front of me. Phil really did something terrible. I owe you more gratitude than I can ever express. She murmured the same words she had a year ago and cried. I felt my eyes well up too, but held back and asked her. More importantly, are you okay? You seem much thinner. Yes. I've been out of money. I haven't been able to eat well lately. What? My bank book disappeared about a month ago, and I hardly have any money left. I glared at Phil. He started panicking at my gaze. From his reaction, it was clear he was involved in this. What is going on? At my loud voice, Phil flinched. I see. Now it was all becoming clear. Phil must have rummaged through his mother's bank book and, finding less balance than he expected, assumed I had used the money. That's why he demanded compensation when we met by chance. Never mind. I don't intend to listen to any excuses. No matter what Phil says, it will not quell my anger. Mary, would you like to live with me? Huh? Hey, what are you saying? I ignored Phil and continued speaking to the mother-in-law. If so, why not consider adopting her as your child? The lawyer immediately offered his advice. I was very open to the idea. Tears welled up in the mother-in-law's eyes as she asked me again, is that really okay? Of course. I responded with a smile. Hey, Mom. Don't be deceived by her. You have a son, remember? But Phil was desperate not to lose his mother. The mother-in-law said, Phil is a precious son to me. But Stacy, you were like a daughter to me too. I still can't forgive you for driving her out. Tears streaming down her face, the mother-in-law slowly stood up. Let me just grab my things. And then she slowly disappeared back into the house. leaving Phil in a daze at the entrance. The lawyer, the mother-in-law, Claire, and I all left the house together. Please watch your step, mother. As I said this and took her hand, Phil seemed unable to respond. He probably never even bothered to show such consideration. After Claire left him, I received a call from the lawyer that the divorce had been finalized. Apparently, Phil had also been asked to pay compensation. He wanted to use that compensation to pay for my legal fees, but I refused. Claire is still young, and having money won't hurt her. I believe she will use it well for herself. In addition to paying me compensation, Phil had to pay Claire as well. The total compensation to both of us was too high for Phil's salary, and he couldn't even get a loan. Therefore, he took a loan only for Claire's compensation. And I agreed to accept mine in installments. I planned to give it all to my mother-in-law. Phil would now live a lonely life, chasing payments. Having always been self-centered, struggling just to make ends meet might be good for him. Later, I discussed it again with the mother-in-law and completed the adoption process. It's unlikely that Phil, now penniless, would come to take the mother-in-law back. But it seemed better to be prepared in case something happened. After moving in with me, the mother-in-law started regaining her vigor, resembling more of the mother-in-law I knew. Her smiles returned, and I felt truly glad. I'm so glad I met you, Stacy. Hearing this from the mother-in-law made me slightly resentful that it was thanks to Phil. But I want to do my filial duty to her, something I couldn't do for my own parents. Having gone through this experience, I decided to use most of my assets to support children who are also orphans like me, and young people who are despairing about life. Helping others isn't anything grand, but I firmly believe that as long as you keep living, there will come a day when you can laugh again. I want to share the happiness I've felt, and that's what inspired this decision.